My goal here, it's almost 2018, amazingly, is to think a couple of years out at least. Much news budgeting is, is quarter by quarter. We need to think basically of how this industry, the news industry in all its forms, traditional and new, is going to survive at this point. And that's the truth of this. So where are we 25 years after the browser? This is a long history now. I was lucky to be involved at the beginning in Silicon Valley. So for most newspaper companies, we're talking about daily newspaper companies for the most part, we'll talk about some others, digital is no more than a third of revenues. So this is 25 years after the browser, 20 years after many websites went up, and unfortunately this number is down to 20 or 25%. So they have not transitioned. This is the basic problem of our news industry in the United States. And my goal here, as I have on here, is order to chaos has pretty well happened. We are in an absolutely chaotic state, and we have to recognize that. And the good news is we can get to a new order, and there are some promising signs, including a number of things that Randy mentioned already. So we're fighting bravely on. There are a lot of casualties on that battlefield. Now, the latest thing this year is Ethereum. I don't know how many know about Ethereum, the cryptocurrency. Our guest from Mozilla knows about it. Are you investing in Ethereum?
I'm using it to buy Evan coin.
Ah. Will you do an extra seminar on that for everybody that wants it? So there are actually 2 journalism startups that are now Ethereum-based. I don't think that's going to be the answer, but it shows you what people are doing. My basic thesis is we have, in 2017, the basic building blocks to rebuild a strong and, in fact, stronger news industry. They're here. And the truth, this is changed from a bit and borrowed from William Gibson, is that the future business model for next generation news is here. It's just not evenly distributed. And I think that's a really important point. Because as I've talked to publishers now, I've done analyst work for 12 years since I left Knight Ridder, I still hear from people, we don't know what we're going to do. We don't think anyone has figured it out. If I hear that phrase one more time, we're going to scream. It's not true. The work is executing on what we have learned. And it's hard work. It takes talent, more talent than, frankly, in the industry at this point. And it takes money, and it takes vision. And it's on a much higher level. In fact, I think it's on a higher level than the news we practiced for decades in daily newspapers. Higher, not lower. And it's on a foundation of technology-driven knowledge. Everything that you can count to put together a business, propensity modeling, which Randy mentioned, that's a basic core part of the business. It's no longer kind of a joke that you've got your nerd in the corner. This is the foundation of your business. The companies understand that, have a chance of succeeding. Those that don't, they're just going under. So, since 2010, 2010 was the year before the New York Times introduced its paywall. They announced in 2010, launched it a year later. And at that point, you can honestly say, whoa, I don't know what's going to happen. 2009, the news industry lost 19% of its revenue in the recession, the Great Recession. And since 2010, look at what we have. These are all news streams. They are all working. Now, there are what? There are 6 of them here. And I'm going to get into each of these in a few minutes. I wrote a piece for Neiman. I write for the Neiman Journalism Lab, and I write for TheStreet.com. 2 very different audiences, and it's good to have those different audiences. And I said a couple of weeks ago, this is our Peggy Lee moment. There are very few people in this room that actually remember Peggy Lee, and I won't ask you to raise your hands. Great singer in the 50s and 60s, and one of her songs that still survives today, and I recommend it, 99 cents, is That All There Is? And so we are at a point now 6 years after the New York Times paywall where there's paywalls at more than half of US dailies, some top magazines, but some of them have hit a wall. And the question is, what's next with reader revenue? So what is our emerging model? In short form, it is for the publications that are succeeding, mainly at the national level, but increasingly at the local level, Star Tribune among them. Majority reader revenue. This is a huge revolution. All the years when newspapers were raking in the money from advertising, 20% of their revenue came from readers. And it was practically considered a loss leader. Now, majority reader revenue. New ads, new ad kinds of revenue. We'll talk about that. But it's secondary to reader revenue. And then third and fourth sources, 10% plus, maybe 20%. So today I want to talk about 2017 realities, fakery and trust, the business of relationship, models that work, including these. So realities. News reading trend. This is from ComScore, to borrow a word from you-know-who. News reading is big. And this is not just Donald Trump bump. This has been over I think this is a 3-year period. News reading is big. It is absolutely true. The audience is there. Especially the smartphone, but digital devices overall have increased people's reading of news, but it's a business model problem. You look at it overall, 71% is a 3-year period, newspaper reading, not news reading, but newspaper reading up. And this is even with a poor experience on a lot of news sites and on the phone. 71%. But when you look under these numbers, you find this. May of this year, 44% of all the newspaper time spent was on the Times and the Post. That's a huge difference. Okay, so why? And we got to really ask that question and get beyond facile answers. Well, yeah, the news is more national. That is obviously true, but it is more than that. Local newspapers are producing less content. The New York Times and the Washington Post particularly, and I give CNN credit as well, have stepped up. They have stepped up their game, and we have other national players that are incredibly busy in this sphere. And they have risen to the occasion, and it's a fairly simple equation. Produce really good content day after day after day. Do your job of reporting on the news of the day, and people will read it. Talk to news publishers and see if you ever hear that. If they actually believe, local news publishers, they actually believe that if they produce more and better content, they're going to have a better business. Fundamental point. And then the products. The New York Times and the Washington Post have very good smartphone products. And I hope all of you use them. And the experience of local products is pretty poor. Now, there are more reasons, but these are top reasons. Let's talk about fakery and trust. You know this guy. He's not smiling too much the last couple of weeks. And this is what he said after the election, in the shock of the election. First he said, we don't really have an impact on how people think, which was one of the dumbest things that anybody had ever said for a site that had 6 hours of attention a month. 99% is authentic, so I did the math. 1% equals 50 million potentially fake posts every day. I don't think he says, well, if Facebook has an uptime of 99% on the web, that's okay. But this is the kind of simple thinking that people put out there, and it wasn't challenged. So, return of civics, it got lots of money, millions of dollars. God love the foundations, they're pouring money in. They don't know into what. Well, let's fix this, because it is about trust. They're trying to do the right thing. Trust. We know what that is. We know that between us. It's credibility, it's integrity, and it's vetting. This is what journalists do. This is very simple. This is not confusing. So let's not be confused by it. Now today we have a very bad case of what I call platform-itis. The platforms, though, mainly Google and Facebook, Twitter to some extent, face a lot of peril. And they are really scared. They're not going to go out of business like a newspaper company could, but they are scared. And they face a reckoning. And it's more of a political reckoning at this point in this volatile and unpredictable political time that we're in than it is a business one. But they profoundly understand that they have to figure out a better way forward. They're in the crosshairs. This is one of those memorable pictures we'll look back on in 10 years, I hope, and smile. This is our president, the vice president, looking fawningly at him, of course. And we have the Google and Facebook executives. Now, you can imagine what they're actually thinking, but they're there. And as you see from the headlines over the last week especially, Congress, which likes to grandstand, is now putting these companies in the crosshairs. What happened during the election? What was their part in it? Why did it happen? These are very uncomfortable questions for companies that like to be very private. Now, we talk about the election. We could spend a whole hour on this if we want to talk about this later. There is a direct lineage which is very hard to prove. Like, it's very hard to prove with all the Russian hacking to death throw the election, right? Very hard to count those numbers, to connect those final dots. I submit that the failure of local journalism, essentially local journalism being halved over the period since 1990, produced in part the results of the election. And one example, just one example I use, I lived in St. Paul for 9 years, worked as the Pioneer Press there. St. Cloud is a mid-sized city just north of Twin Cities by an hour. And there was a major anti-Somali movement, basically racist, anti-immigrant. The newspaper, Gannett newspaper, didn't cover it. This is a story from This American Life that did cover it. After the election, I looked and I saw that the election had flipped 10 points in that city from 2012 to 2016. This happened across, and Minnesota ended up going for Clinton, but this happened across the country, and especially we can look at Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Michigan. Many, many examples of this, and I haven't tried to track it down, but I think there is an essential truth there, and we have to live, all of us, with the consequences. This headline from a few days ago. So this isn't last year in the Russians, this is Las Vegas. These guys can't get it right? They put out misinformation just like real information. And we know the problem, and other people are starting to see the problem, although it's becoming political and confused. These are not news companies. They're kind of pretending, and they have pretended to be news companies, but they're not news companies. So, meanwhile, in business, Google has cozied up to publishers, and I wrote about this last week. First Click Free existed for more than a decade, and it said, if you're a news publisher and you want your stuff to be found, which you did because Google contributes about 38% of a news site's traffic, you had to give 3 free clicks a day from Google to a news site. That's 90 a month, plus say 10 if there's a meter. So there could be 100 free clicks, and these are sites that are now depending more and more on reader revenue. Publishers hated it. They talked to Google for years about it, and Google would not relent. Finally, it did. Now, at the same time, Facebook, and their this is the main competition now for advertising dollars between these two companies, they had put in place a new subscription program. And they planned to announce it 3 days before Google actually did First Click Free. I wrote about it because I talked to a number of the participants, and the participants said, well, we might try it, but the Times and the Post and a few others weren't in it because, guess what? Facebook said, we'll help you sell subscriptions, but you have to give people 10 views for free. And they go like, wait a minute. We finally convinced Google after a decade to drop that silliness and let us do what we want. And they said, no, that's the rule. They still have not announced this program. There's a lot of skirmishing here, and publishers are trying to figure out how to play these two behemoths against each other. So the realization and the opportunity out of this platformitis that we've been in for the last 4 or 5 years is there's gossip and then there's news. Many people and enough people understand the difference. So this is inspiring subscription surges. You get to talk about those in a minute here. On the advertising front, this is another very important reality. So they've built an unassailable duopoly at this point. And you look at these numbers, and they are amazing. So how much, does anybody know how much of the digital ad growth last year, I bet Mr. Gehring knows. That is a dark view of it. That's 2018. In last year, went to Facebook and Google, 89% of the growth in digital advertising. Digital advertising is now the #1 ad type in the country. It passed TV, combined broadcast and cable last year. So it's still growing, slowed down a little because it's got a huge base, but still growing a lot, 89%. And you look at these numbers, and basically it shows, and also I'm happy to make this presentation available for numbers in a PDF if anybody wants to have it. You look at, so they get all this growth, which means $6 billion new dollars to Google, $5 billion new dollars to Facebook, and $1.4 billion to everybody else who publishes, this is a US number, publishes in the US. Not a news company, anybody that sells advertising. 1.4 billion. It's not a lot of money. And we are headed toward 100%, maybe 110, we'll see. Daily newspapers, if you had told somebody in 2007, say 10 years ago, that the daily newspaper industry, which was a huge profitable industry, as you can see from this building, would be down $30 billion every year from its height, they would say, number one, it couldn't happen, and number two, there won't be newspapers anymore. Maybe a dozen newspapers actually go out of business now, every year. There's still 1,350, and 99% of them are profitable. There's very interesting math in that, but consider this $30 billion, and where did that go? Largely, and not one-to-one translation, but largely Google and Facebook. It turns out that is their number for profits between the two of them. Don't be evil, remember this? We don't hear this much anymore. I don't know, I didn't hear this before Congress. Don't be evil, be rich. Much better. I should suggest that to them. So 30 billion, there's the number. And these aren't news companies. So anybody can say Google News. I remember when Google started Google News, the news company. Well, it's got a great algorithm. Does that make it a news company? Mm-hmm. Facebook, clearly not a news company. They're advertising companies. They are great innovators, brilliant people, have created life-changing products. There's no question about that. But they're not news companies. And they are advertising companies. And there is a question about whether they have unfair market domination. But you may have noticed this is kind of an anti-regulation time. And so the fact of their bigness on the business front is not going to be taken on. What happens to them on the political front is their new concern. On the horizon, just to mention this, so those of us who've been around for a while remember the term convergence. Because if you have a local news operation and you have, Jim, did you work in convergence?
Sure.
Yep. We had, what was that, 10 years ago? 15? 10 years ago. It made sense, you say, and Tampa did it. Tampa was one of the leaders in it. So you got TV operations, you have newspaper operations. What are they doing? They're both getting news. One of them's getting video-oriented, one of them's getting text-oriented. It should be simple, given the internet, to kind of put these staffs together and produce both. Never worked. It has never worked very well. Worked a little in some places. But now, it's the second coming. So, one of the things that's changing is the FCC is now in Republican hands and anti-regulatory hands. And there has been a long-standing push, which is endorsed by the Newspaper Trade Association and the TV Trade Association and many others, to remove these restrictions, which have been there for decades, on a big local TV station owning a newspaper and vice versa. For instance, Rupert Murdoch wanted to buy the LA Times 8 or 10 years ago, but couldn't because he has 2 stations in LA. Expect that to go away within the next 1 to 2 years. It's a long regulatory process with hearings, but that will change the landscape, and not too many people are talking about it. Got cross-ownership, newspaper antitrust rules, combinations of a few remaining papers, and this rule has changed as well. Sinclair, how many of you saw John Oliver's episode on Sinclair? If you haven't seen it, you have to see it. I want to go to New York and interview John Oliver's staff, because he has a staff of crack journalists that are producing that show. I don't know, they're kind of anonymous, I think, but incredible. And he's brought more light to this than journalists working for journalistic organizations have. Sinclair is huge. They've taken this, they bought the old Circa app, they just took the name. They have 200 stations in 81 markets, incredible reach, and they are doing mandated editorials that are kind of fact-free. Raycom, last week, got no attention. I'm hoping to write about this next week. Community newspapers, CNHI, 110 newspapers around the country. Fairly big company, you don't hear about it a lot. Raycom, I think about 28 stations, pretty big broadcast, regional broadcast player, merged. They decided to merge. And on this one, very interestingly, it was the TV company that bought the newspaper company. It's a subsidiary. Now, right now, under cross-ownership rules, where they have operations in the same city, they can't combine them. But we're going to see a lot more of this, and TV is more likely to be dominant than newspaper, with TV's rules of the road of how it covers local news, probably more than newspapers, which is another cause of concern for me. Numbers are important. So broadcast journalists, 27,600, the latest census of them. Interesting number, 26,000 daily newspaper journalists. This is the first time, probably 2017, that this has been the case, where you have this flip. Okay, who wants to take a guess at this one? How many daily newspaper journalists, 1990? Well, first I want to know how many people here were born after 1990? Seriously, raise your hand. Okay. How many journalists in 1990 working for daily newspapers?
49,000.
That's a pretty good guess. 56,900, that was the top, 1990. Actually started going down, because this is actually an industry that has been losing its market share, losing its position longer than the internet has disrupted it, but that's kind of a dirty little secret of it. But the number, 56,000 to half of that. Population's grown by 80 million people in the United States. We seem to have a few problems in this country, and we have much less local press and much less knowledgeable local press, because when you lay off people, you lay off the most experienced, highest paid people. So what we have is parched local journalism. National journalism is struggling, but you can see a way forward with that. It's a question of scale, it's a question of vision, it's a question of quality, but parched local journalism. And it is a 3,000-mile wide now news desert. There's some maps out there, but just go into any city and look at, if you know what a newspaper was like 10 years ago, whether it's a community of 50,000 or 500,000, you can tell, and look at the websites as well. So daily journalism, half empty or half full, and the local newspaper model. Now this is one thing that I've talked to publishers about too, and it bothers me a great deal. If you look at that bottle on the right, that's what newspapers used to be in terms of product. It's like twice as big, and you charge $1 for it, say. Look at the product on the left, about half the size maybe. You charge $2 for it. Now I ask publishers when I show them this at certain conferences, can you tell me another industry that has done this and succeeded? And they can't. And they freely acknowledge, yeah, they've done it. And they'll say, we had to do it. Okay, you had to do it, maybe, maybe not, but that's still a reality. That is not a business strategy. That bottle keeps on getting smaller. The price of it keeps going up. You can see how that story ends at many places. And are doing less and less for audiences and charging more and more. We got mega clustering, and we have two models out there, and we're getting to the positive side of the story right now. I like to depress people first. And it is basically, there's two strategies. There's grow it or milk it. There are 3 companies now, Digital First Media, Gannett, and Gatehouse, that own 1/4 of all the 1,350 dailies in the country, and they're gaining slowly that share of it. And they have different faces, and they have different people in those companies, and some are absolutely rapacious. Some are trying to do the right thing, but not succeeding. But basically, those three companies, when you look at what they're doing and keep on cutting staff, are milking it. So let's talk about growing it in the face of reinvestment. Here's a good example. A couple months ago, Hearst bought Digital First Media Papers in Connecticut, the New Haven Register most prominently among them, and 2 weeklies. So in Connecticut now, it owns 7 of 13. It's got its own cluster there. Hearst is a huge private company, privately owned company, doesn't concern itself that much with quarterly profits, very concerned about profits, but not quarterly profits, and actually believes in investing. So, very interesting in this one, and this was an unusual example. If you look at the newsrooms in Connecticut, they're actually adding 25 full-time people. So they've got 7 newspapers. They're going to do this clustering like a lot of newspapers do, where they say, like, we don't need 4 sports reporters covering the same game. We're going to do that smartly. If you have smart editors, they can do that well. But we're going to deploy people very smartly, and we're going to cover the old beats, and we're going to cover some new beats. And they went up 25. Digital First Media had cut the New Haven Register, which was never a great paper, but they had cut it from being mediocre to awful in terms of its resources. Register, they went from 38 to 48. That's a huge difference. And they said, what's the most important institutions, especially statewide, like UConn and Yale, Pratt and Whitney? And they said, we need smart people who know how to cover these. Last I heard, they were looking for a regional editor for Connecticut, a great job, and hard to find somebody. Now, we have the new Sun-Times ownership. We've got the civil buyers. This is Edwin Eisendrath in Chicago, former alderman. He bought the paper away from Michael Farrow, who tried to buy it and combine it with Chicago Tribune. And they don't really know where they're going to go digitally, but civic buyers that really want to do the right thing. Berkshire Eagle, this can be done. They went to Digital First Media, and they said, you've wrecked our papers. We don't like it. 4 business people. Let's buy it. They named the price, and they bought it, and they are reinvesting. They're hiring more reporters, maybe like 6 or 8, but it's a small area, and they have news values. Glenn Taylor in the Twin Cities, great example. A erstwhile liberal Republican, if you remember those, legislator in Minnesota, and Minnesota, I was lucky enough to live there. It's a good government place. Star Tribune went through a bunch of ownership changes, and he said, this is an important institution to the city and the state. I'll buy it. We're going to have a business plan. I'm not going to put a huge amount of money in this, but we're going to run this as a successful business. And they have. This guy, he's rightfully happy. This is the picture we want across the newspaper industry in a couple of years. So, hired 140 new journalists. Marty Barron knew who to hire, the editor. 125 new techies. They are working together, and they're creating a new model for the industry. And look what happened. They have rejoined the news elite, and this happened in 3 years. It can happen. There's this roiling at the LA Times that I've covered recently, and it's brought up a whole set of questions. The LA Times is not the Washington Post, but it used to be in that category. And there's a new publisher there, and I've talked to him. There's aspiration there, but if you look at the blocking and tackling that this guy did compared to what Tronc has done, it's 2 different worlds. So, it's not hard. That's why I'm saying there's a playbook. There's a long-term investment in product and technology. They focus on customer experience, and they use data to make money. Again, this is the playbook. This is known. And it isn't just Jeff Bezos and Amazon. There are a lot of people who are at the Post, but they got backing, runway as he called it, they got money, and they put the system into place. And if you're not familiar with the system, check it out. This is the Washington Post ARC system. It's a platform now being used by 20 publishers from the Globe and Mail in Toronto. Tronc itself has licensed it and will launch it in LA in January. It's a full-featured system. It is digital only, and it is all based in data. So digital-only startups. Billy Penn, you may have heard about, Philadelphia, Denverite. And this company, that's Jim Brady, a longtime entrepreneur in digital news. Gordon Cozies, former publisher and now an investor, former publisher at the Journal. And so, again, you see these same words, smartphone-oriented. This is a millennials-oriented product, 70% smartphone, events-based revenue, and up to 28 people in 3 sites. Planning a 4th site, would like to do a dozen if they can get the formula right. And Gannett's got a seat on the board and put in about $1 million and said, we want to figure out what these guys are doing. Sue will talk about this in our panel at 11. 250 nonprofit newsrooms. These is a significant growth, which we'll talk about then. And where do they fit in? Very interesting question. The big question, I think, on them is simply this. For all that we have lost, how do we gain enough back? So the basis of all these business models, when you step back from them, is relationship. And this is something that I think too many people in the business have lost sight of. Mark Thompson, CEO of the New York Times Company, who has done a great job in 5 years there. He came out with a statistic about 2 years ago, saying that only 12% of their digital audience drives 88% of their digital revenue. Now, this is an amazing statistic. And I just checked back with the Times for another piece that I'm writing, and I said, Mark said this 2 years ago. What's the number now? Actually, I wrote him, and he said, that's a good question. We haven't figured it out. So they went back, and they looked at it, and they said, we don't have a number yet, but we think that this number is actually lower now. Maybe it's 10 or 11%, I had the sense of, even though their digital audience has doubled in that time. So that's their pool of people who are paying and the people who are heavy users. What do most companies do? They chase clicks. Still, if you look at a lot of sites, they're chasing clicks and page views. They're not. They want a lot of new people at the top of that subscription funnel. But they focus on these people who are customers. Numbers that matter. So unique visitors. Huge digital audiences, that's great. Fairly meaningless as a big number. 1% to 2% will pay for a digital-only subscription. Not a bad number if you got 100 million, right? New York Times, unique audience. You only have 5 million, it's a problem. 5% may register. Registration is important, creates a relationship. 10 to 15% read 15% of the pages. 50% plus of the pages. Small percentage. And 20% consume significant ad pages. So again, a small part of that population. And most publishers are looking too much, although this is now thankfully in transition, at the big audience instead of saying, how do I find people who know actually my news brand and value it? That's the word. I come from, worked in Silicon Valley for a number of years, and our term users, it's a fine IT term, it's a fine tech term. It's an odious term, I think, for news companies. I mean, when I grew up, users were people who put drugs into their veins. Now that changed, and I understand it, and user testing is all good, and user experience. But customers, think about this from a business perspective. I got people who know my brand, they like it, maybe they'll pay me. I have a relationship with them. This is that basic, and it's not recognized. What was a newspaper? Newspaper started as a village center back in Europe. It goes back hundreds of years. Reading, buying, doing, passing time, and building community. That's what newspapers did. Yeah, they printed a paper, but that's how you used it. And I remember the Scarborough statistics, 15, 20 minutes a day, people would spend with the daily newspaper doing these kinds of things. They had a relationship with it. Wasn't a warm and fuzzy one, but they had a relationship. So this truth, another truth here, news companies are less a part of people's lives than they used to be. And think about the things that you pay for in your civilian life away from journalism business. You pay for things that have some meaning to you. If you're using a news site 6, 8, 10 minutes a month, you're not going to use it. You're not going to use a payment mechanism. You're not going to subscribe. You got to build habit, and then get people to pay. I talked to Texas Newspaper Association a couple of years ago, and one of the publishers came up and said, "Yeah, Facebook, I don't know about them." He said, "You know, they don't know anything about our community." Well, really true. Look at a news site and see, including this publisher's news site, if the news site shows that they know more about their city than Facebook does. They do. The people in that newsroom, if there's enough of them left, do know more about it, but they're not showing it in digital form. They may be showing it some in print form. Huge question right now, what's on your phone? Look on your phone right now, if you would, and see if you have a local news app of some kind or a browser that you've turned into an app. Anybody have one? We have one. Bill. One more back there. We have 3, 4. So 5. So do I hear 6? Oh, it's a Berkshire Eagle. That's even better. When did you put it on there?
A few months ago.
So look at this. This is a group of people who care about news, I would assume. And there's no local news icon presence, which is a proxy for a daily habit. If people ask me for one recommendation, I'd say make your experience good enough that people will put it on this first screen and use it. How's that for a goal? So what's old is new here. This is not all complicated and techy and all that kind of stuff. It's relationships. It's readers, it's merchants, it's community. So what do you know about your readers? We can call this analytics, we can call it about data science, audience development, it's all the same thing. Unknown to known. Anonymous to known. Who are they? When do they read? What do they read on? And deeper and deeper and deeper. Scroll depth is a big thing now to figure out how far they're reading down. And then relate this to the top 10 or 15%. What do these people do and what do they want to know? They're leaving breadcrumbs for you. Google's figuring out their intent and making $30 billion in profit. No, $20 billion in profit. What's their intent? Take their intent and give them more of what they want. So refocusing on relationships is, I think, absolutely key, and that's the future of the news business. Deep, wide, and data laden. So I got to see Front Page. There was a revival of it on Broadway last year, or early this year with Nathan Lane. It was incredible. And it also could bring you to tears considering the intensity and the passion around a certain kind of journalism. The guy on the right, he's not a front page journalist. He is a nerd, as he plainly says with his picture. His name is Tom Betts, and he is the chief data scientist at the Financial Times, which in 2009 transformed itself from an old-fashioned company into a company they said wanted to be the Amazon of publishing. They had 9 people in research who were doing PowerPoints for their advertising staff. They dispatched them and started a data science team, which now numbers between 40 and 50. And it's the center of their business. They make their decisions based on the data, and it's the editors and the business side people taking the data and making sense of it. So that's our building blocks, right? Reader revenue. We have heightened interest, reader revenue, that's good in these times. Increased news reading, we know that, and an avalanche of subscription. So this surge, which I wrote about a lot the first half of the year, this is basically the period between the election and the middle of the year. New York Times was adding about 100,000 a month. It's a lot of people. It's a lot of money. Washington Post added 300,000, still growing rapidly, just past 1 million. New Yorker growing rapidly. And the Atlantic doubling the number of its subscriptions. Now, you can see a theme here in terms of the quality of what they did and how they engaged the times we live in. Top regionals, LA Times just hit 105,000. That's the regional leader. A lot of these are low-cost trial subscriptions, but we can hope that they continue. Boston Globe's been at it for longer, 90,000. Star Tribune, 50,000. So you can see the wide difference between those national and those regional numbers. But these numbers are getting closer to sustaining a business and building the new business. Why is reader revenue so important? Remember the Google, Facebook duopoly numbers and the dwindling amount of new dollars going to anybody else. Reader revenue is far more stable. You subscribe to a news publication, you give them a credit card. If you still like it, you're going to let it go. And the retention rates are pretty good for good publications. It's far more stable going forward. And the New York Times is the poster child for this. The last report, last public report, second quarter, if they could maintain this, we could say they succeeded, which would be an amazing thing to say considering this is a paper that took a major loan from Carlos Slim in 2009 at 14.5% interest just to stay alive. So, second quarter, 9% up in total revenue. Most newspapers are down 5 to 10%. They were plus 1 million in ad revenue. Very good number. They're up to 2.3 million digital-only subs. 2 million of those are news, 300,000 crosswords. And the magic number here, 60% reader revenue. This is a company that 10 years ago would have been 25 to 30% reader revenue and the rest advertising. And that was the structure of the industry. Now, 60% reader revenue. As I said, stable, relatively stable. And so the stability of this, even with major challenges in advertising, see, it's basically flat, able to grow revenue 9%. Let's hope they stay there. Here's your crossover number. This is from 2004. There's the paywall right here. That's when consumer revenue surpassed advertising revenue. Same chart is true of Financial Times, Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, probably 55% reader revenue at this point. But we have this national divide between national and local, 60%, great. US dailies, 30%. Again, this is another one of those slides that says, that's the problem, right? If you can do 60% reader revenue, you can piece together advertising, events, podcasts, this and that, to build up other revenue sources that could keep you revenue positive. But if you're 30% reader revenue and essentially 65% ad revenue, there's no way you can grow revenue given all the vicissitudes of digital and print advertising. People say, well, but that's the Washington Post or the New York Times. That's another thing I get tired of hearing about. And yes, but what can we learn? Well, they've taken a long-term view. They have said, we're not building just for the next quarter. The New York Times got rid of their dividends. They may have reinstituted a small one, I can't remember. But they're building long-term. They're doing everything they can with the number one goal of retaining high-quality content producing capacity. That's key to their business. So, what are the other lessons? Reader content focus, value exchange. They're saying, we're giving you a lot of stuff. They've created a very good smartphone experience. Very different ones, but both very good. They have new ad business lines, talk about that in a sec, and they rely on analytics. So this is another one of those playbooks slides. People say, well, it doesn't apply to me. Well, yeah, all those things apply to you. You don't have to have 50 data scientists. Star Tribune just hired their first data scientist, and he's helping them with digital circulation churn, and they're overjoyed. Hire one, hire two. Focus on this. For God's sakes, have a product that people can use well on the smartphone when 60% of access to news in the United States is by mobile. Star Tribune, talk about a regional one. So Star Tribune is at 50% reader revenue. Average, I said, about 30. They're at 50. What's that meant? Well, they're flat revenue. They're struggling like everybody else, and they're doing a lot of smart things in the advertising side. Their reader revenue program has been smart, but flat revenue is way at the top of the list among regionals. Most of them, as I said, are down 5 to 10. Core, 250 people in the newsroom. And they've retained a lot of veterans. They've retained a lot of people who actually know the Twin Cities. And columnists, people that people identify with. This is, again, not new stuff. And they have innovative ad products. Well, they're doing it. They're not the New York Times. They've got an owner who's long-term, and they're saying, this is what's important. Their publisher is not a former editor. He's a CFO, Mike Klingensmith. And he will tell you it's boring. We will just execute, and they are running an operation which is the high end, I think, of what's going on in regional news in the United States in terms of the business and way up there in terms of editorial quality. There you go. Pretty simple. Now, one other thing I want to mention here is newsletters. So newsletters have gone, we started doing newsletters back when I was at Knight Ridder in 98, 99. We were doing newsletters. It seemed like a good idea. But we didn't really do much when people signed up with their email address with their email addresses. We didn't know about targeting. It was in its infancy. And now, if you look at this, many publications, including regional ones, are doing it. And why? Open rates of 50 to 70%, double conversion rates, engagement rates of 40%. And the Boston Globe, a leader in digital circulation, says this is the number1 way they get people to subscribe. It's a daily newspaper. It's basically saying it's a crazy world out there, especially in these times. We'll catch you up. We'll tell you what's most important. And we won't just even say, here's the one newsletter. Here's 50 newsletters. If you're interested in politics, you're interested in business, you're interested in food, we'll catch you up. And people say, thank you. And they open it up, and they open it up out of their inboxes that people said they would never go to anymore. So we have that moment I talked about, and what's out there in terms of new models, 2.0. So it's going in the right direction, but it's slow for regionals. Part of this is pricing. So, okay, you got X number of people, great. You want to have more of them, you want to have twice as many of them. But also, how much do you charge them, right? Simple multiplier. John Henry, the owner of the Boston Globe, said to his people, I was there that week, he said, I want to go to $1 a day. And the people said, oh no, please don't do that. Circulation guy, Peter Doucette, who's a great guy, said, I was scared. He'd built a good list, probably at 65, 70,000 at that point, and he said, I didn't know what would happen. So this is about a year ago, it's probably about 18 months ago now, and John said, basically, damn it, we're providing a great news report. I'm keeping the newsroom as whole as I can. We're trying to create better mobile products. I want to say to people, give us $1 a day. And it's worked. They moved from a kind of industry average of 57, 58 cents a day to $1 a day. That's $365 a year for a non-paper version of the Boston Globe, and they just hit 90,000. So pricing is huge. But you have to have the product, the physical product on the phone, and the content behind it. And then there's middle of the funnel. This is Tony Hale from Scroll. I wrote about this a couple weeks ago. New startup. He was the founder of Chartbeat and very well regarded in the industry. And this will be a product launching sometime early next year, ad-free, $5 monthly subscription. So he's saying middle of the funnel. There's people who might not pay you $200 a year, but they might pay you $5 a month. So check out this model if you're interested in it. I wrote a couple pieces for Neiman and The Street. Cosman is here. Cosman, where are you? Is he in the room? He's in the back of the room, and he's going to be on a panel later. And later panel, I was able to write about this as well. A similar idea, done differently, of saying, okay, people need a ramp. Let them buy an article. Let them buy a week's pass. So there's a whole new round, and I think we have someone from Invisibly here. There's a whole new round of people saying, okay, get the people who pay you $200 or $350 a year, but get the others as well. The FT moved from the meter to trialing and has almost doubled the number of its subscriptions. So there's a lot of new ferment here in reader revenue. E-commerce, Raju Narasetti is going to be here later this afternoon for a panel, and then I'm going to have a conversation with him tomorrow. I call this reader-related revenue. They're selling stuff. They sell a lot of stuff. Remember this guy, Hulk Hogan? So Gawker faded into history, lawsuit, all that kind of stuff. But what survived was their deals. And this is now the basis for the Gizmodo Media Group that Raju heads and is becoming the model for the wider Univision, which owns GMG. You may have noticed the New York Times making a major push with Wirecutter, which is also an e-commerce play. We'll talk more about that tomorrow. Truth, you're back to truth. What do you do with truth and trust? In their case, they're saying, turn it into money, turn it into transaction. Advertising, +1 advertising, I call it. So if you look at this, desktop advertising is falling as fast or faster than print. Happened pretty fast, the desktop revolution. But what's happening is there are a lot of plus strategies. So what did newspapers do and what did broadcast stations do? Newspapers said, will you buy this space? Yes or no. Broadcast stations said, will you buy this time? Yes or no. Now it's about relationship. How do I have a relationship with a merchant? How do I know what they want to sell and how do I help them sell it? So you have marketing services that's going on locally, helping them with their websites, their mobile presence, Facebook, etc. Branded content, which is storytelling. T-Brand Studio, if you haven't looked at that, look at that. Events plus display. Oh, you're doing that? Well, we'll put some ads in the paper, but we'll also support your event. Video, same thing. And e-commerce. So advertising survives, but it morphs. The need for people in America especially to sell stuff will never go away. How do you help them sell stuff? Display is fading. And this woman, Meredith Levine, who is now the #2 person in business at the New York Times, said basically we made a huge shift. We used to be 60% oriented on the old type of space selling. In 1 year's time, they moved that to only 40% through employing a number of the things that I just said. So if you look at this T-Brand, which is their branded marketing, content marketing, is 15 to 20% of their revenue. If you look at Hearst, again, a smart company at executing, they tell me that of their advertising sales, 90% have some branded content part, essentially a relationship of saying, how do I help you sell your stuff? We have the Dallas Morning News, Randy mentioned as a really good example, and their strategy is around digital commerce, and they're up to 20% marketing money. And what they have done there under Jim Maroney is moved their share of this overall revenue, much more digital marketing revenue here and much less core print revenue. That's the key to it. And they're moving forward. They have 5 different businesses. They are moving them under closer to one umbrella over time. It's a very smart company. And again, they've got it figured out. They've got a model. And you want to talk about New York Times, talk about the Victoria Advocate in Texas, all about content marketing and branded content and pulling it off successfully in a very small market. Events, just talk about for a minute here, and I know we're going to have a panel that's going to talk about that. Importantly, this comes out of different budgets. It comes out of ad budgets. It comes out of promotion budgets, community service budgets, events budgets. Jason Taylor is the head of Gatehouse Live. We have, I don't know if anybody is here yet from Gatehouse. Anybody here from Gatehouse Events, Gatehouse Live? Somebody's coming to talk about this. It's a fascinating business. So I met Jason in Vail, and whatever it is, 8,000 feet, and everybody else is gasping for breath. And he is going on about his events business that at that point he built in Chattanooga. Gatehouse hires him. They're now doing 240 events a year. It's not a little thing. And if Jason's behind it, they're combining it with advertising. So look for that as we do those panels. Importantly with events, and people are trying to figure out what is it, where do events fit? This is a big point I've heard from a number of people who are proficient in it. It's the glue. So digital, we have distance in a way. It's the physical glue that reconnects with readers, advertisers, and community. Here's the head of the Atlantic media business and in B2B business. And they're doing white label events. They're saying, we're not doing just events of our own. We'll do an event for you because we know how to do events. Big part of their business now. Digital events, white label events. And then audio. So audio, a new part of the business, or is it an extension? I've got a couple stories coming out next week on The Daily. How many of you listen to The Daily, the New York Times podcast? About 5 or 6. They are up to a huge number of downloads, been on the top 10 download list. I recommend it to everybody. And I was skeptical at the beginning because how many, and everybody's launching like, let's catch up on the news, let's have 3 people sit around and talk about the news. And in my mind, there's too much happy talk there. And I looked at the New York Times Daily and I go, every day they are talking to New York Times reporters. They've had 110 of them on that program. And you're finding out the story behind the story. It is really well done, hugely successful, fast-growing audience. They're now going to extend into wider serial-like programs. And there are 12 people working in audio at the New York Times. They're making money. LA Times just launched this last week, Dirty John. A friend of mine called this audio noir. So if you like thrillers, this is a real story. Unfortunately, it's a pretty tragic story. Out of the LA Times had a reporter who did the series, turned it into a 6-part podcast, and it's pretty good. And it's got a business implication. It's quadrupled the number of newsletter signups for the year. There's an emotional attachment there that we can make using these kind of techniques. And there's more in the works. Gannett's now pushing, McClatchy's now pushing, others are pushing into podcasts because they support the business. And then, of course, voice activation coming on very big. And we need news companies to go beyond top-of-the-hour reports and to use that innovatively. So lastly, I just wanted to offer this, and again, this is probably best read if you look at the PDF. This is Justin Smith, the CEO of Bloomberg Media, and one of the smartest people in the media business. He was at Atlantic Media. If you're familiar with Quartz, which was a business news startup, started probably 5 years ago at this point. Atlantic itself, great magazine, a number of B2B restarts and starts. And he has summed up his suggestions for publishers in this 11 points here. And he's talking about the same kinds of things. And I want to put this up here. It's a good keeper. It's a good checklist for anybody studying the business or in the business. But to reinforce the idea that there is a playbook. There is a way of moving forward at this point, not just getting to survival, because survival doesn't work in business. You don't say, if you're selling hamburgers, I want to sell the same number of hamburgers next month as I'm selling this month. You want to grow. It's the nature of business, it's the nature of human beings. We now know how to do this, but we need the kinds of qualities that the successful people have employed. We need long-term vision. You need capacity in terms of wealth. We need focus on content and a belief that news matters and in local communities as well as nationally. And we need products that deliver that content. And I believe that we can nurture these sprouts. I am actively talking to a whole bunch of people that understand that this is truly a news emergency. And especially at a time where we have this week, we have the President of the United States calling for shutting down news media that he doesn't like. It was bad enough a year ago, but now it's an existential question. And we need to consider it as such, not panic, but build on what we know.